My name is Breck Parkman. I retired in 2017, but before that I was a Senior State Archaeologist here in California. I worked as an archaeologist for over 40 years. Today I spend much of my time writing and storytelling, and sometimes I help out my son with ideas for his films. Back in 2001, I was conducting an archaeological and paleontological survey on the Sonoma coast. I was accompanied by a colleague of mine, a paleontologist named Raj Naidu. We were looking for anything we could find that was paleontological in nature. This was a survey we were doing along the Cordham Trail, which runs for miles along the edge of the coastal terrace. I was hoping that we'd find the skeleton of a Columbian mammoth, or something just as cool. Unfortunately, Raj and I didn't find a mammoth skeleton, but we did find something really, really cool. While inspecting a large uplifted sea stack that local climbers call sunset rocks, and I refer to as mammoth rocks, Raj and I noticed an odd polish on the rocks. The polish was shiny in places, and in other places it was really dull, especially higher up on the rock face. The sea stack was the kind of rock that geologists call schist. It's a hard rock, and yet here was this high gloss polish on parts of it. Raj and I looked at the polish and tried to figure out what had caused it. After some deliberation, we decided that the polish had been caused by animals rubbing against the rock. We had both seen cows do this elsewhere, and I knew that bison used rubbing rocks from some field work I'd done with buffalo rubbing rocks on the Canadian plains a few years earlier. The only problem with the sea stack, though, is that the polish was found as high as 14 feet up the rock face. What the heck could have rubbed against that rock that high up? Sunset Rocks are now part of Sonoma Coast State Park, but from the 1870s until the 1970s, it was part of a private ranch, and there were horses and cattle and sheep on the ranch. All of these animals are known to rub against fence posts, trees, and even rocks, but none of them were capable of rubbing the rock 14 feet up its vertical face. I looked at how the polish was dark further down and duller higher up, especially above 5 to 6 feet up the face. I also noticed how whatever had caused the polish was selective. Only certain sides of the sea stack were polished, primarily on the leeward side, out of the prevailing winds which come up strong in the afternoon. The polish was also found in areas that were easily accessible to an animal. And finally, I noticed that the polish was found only on surfaces that could be physically touched by an animal rubbing against the rock. Overhangs were especially polished. Areas with cracks and crevices might have polish on the adjacent rock face, but the polish never penetrated into the cracks. I thought if the polish had been caused by the actions of wind or water, the polish would have not been so discriminating. It was the location and selectivity of the polish that caused me to think that it had been created by now extinct Ice Age megafauna. And like I always remind visitors to the site, there was a time when herds of wild horses, bison, and Columbian mammoth called the area home. All would have rubbed rocks, and the mammoth would have rubbed high above the shoulders of the other big critters. A large Columbian mammoth might have a shoulder height as high up as 14 feet, although most of them were a foot or two shorter than that. I decided that ancient bison and mammoth, and possibly some wild horses too, had caused the polish at Sunset Rocks. The dark, fresh-looking polish found below 6 feet was likely repolished by domestic horses and cattle and sheep during historic times. But the original polish above 6 feet is dull because it was not repolished in recent times. I spent the next few months documenting this discovery. This included the excavation of one test unit beside one of the polish overhangs. I was hoping to find evidence of the megafauna, but I ended my excavation prematurely when I encountered a few pieces of broken rocks associated with a nearby ancient stone quarry. I realized that if I had continued digging, I might have encountered a layer where I could extract ancient mammoth or bison DNA from the soil, but then what? Even if I found mammoth DNA in the soil, that wouldn't mean they rubbed against the rock and made the polish. I decided that the evidence needed was found in the rock and in the polish itself. Two of my colleagues came to my rescue. This included Dr. Rolf Eriksson, who was then a geology professor at Sonoma State University and one of the leading experts on the local geology. The other colleague was the late Professor Stephen Norrick, also of Sonoma State University. Steve was an expert on rock polish. Both of these professors agreed to inspect the site with me. As a result of their inspection, they offered to help me in my research. They agreed that animals probably made the polish. So how did we test that possibility? To get at the truth of the polish, the professors allowed me to use the physics lab at the university, and they provided a student intern to assist me. Small samples of the polish were taken to the lab and analyzed using a scanning electron microscope and an atomic force microscope. After careful study of the lab results, we concluded that the polish had been created by large animals. The polish wasn't the result of wind, or water, or faulting. Over the years, I took a lot of scientists to see the polished rocks. One of the first to visit was Dr. Tim Flannery, who was then the director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide. Here he is examining the polish. Other notable visitors included Professor Gary Haynes of the University of Nevada at Reno, an expert on mammoths, and Dr. David Seaborg, evolutionary biologist and director of the World Rainforest Fund. David is the son of Dr. Glenn T. Seaborg, co-winner of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for 1951. These are just three of the many visitors I took to the site. As word of my discovery got out, I began to get inquiries from the news media. I have always been good about working with the news media. While I could easily reach a few dozen people at an interpretive campfire program, many of which I've given during the course of my career, I realized that I could reach so many more people by working with the news media. During my career, I gave hundreds of interviews to newspapers, radio, and TV, and many of the stories went all over the world. For example, I once did a 3-minute interview with CNN and CNN International for a story about the archaeology of the Grateful Dead at Olompali. The piece was aired several times a day for over a week. The producer later told me that it was a big hit, especially in France and Italy. I wonder how many millions of people I reached that way. One of the first to interview me about the polished rocks was a producer from Travel Radio International. She and her crew met me at the site, and they created an incredible soundscape of animal sounds and me talking about the past. This segment was aired on NPR and on Armed Forces Radio. There were also stories in the local newspapers, including the Santa Rosa Press-Democrat and the San Francisco Chronicle. As word got out, others started calling, requesting interviews with me. One of the first was my old friend, the late Huell Hauser of California's gold fame. Huell arranged with me to film at the Rocks. It was one of my favorite shows with him. KQED also filmed a show with me at the Rocks. It was for their program Quest, and I loved the way it turned out. One other request came from the BBC. They contacted me and asked to include me in a 3-part documentary they were shooting about the Ice Age. I have no idea how they heard about my work, but they did. Anyway, the BBC crew arrived and filmed an interview with me at the Rocks. It was used in episode 1 of Ice Age Giants. Dr. Alice Roberts, a well-known presenter in the UK, was the host of the film, and she accompanied the BBC crew to the site to handle the interview. I enjoyed meeting her and all of the people from the BBC. I told them that I wish I could go back in time and see a mammoth rubbing against the rock. The producer said she'd take care of that. I had no idea she was serious, but using CGI, she created a Columbian mammoth that in the show walks up to the rock I had just been discussing and begins to rub against it. Now, how cool is that? I used to do a lot of appearances on a local radio station, KSVY in Sonoma. And on this one occasion, I was talking about the polished rocks. George Weber, the host of the program, asked how I could prove my theory that the polish had come from ancient animals like mammoth and bison. I told George that there were two ways I could think of to prove the theory. First, I could conduct biochemical research on the polish to look for ancient DNA in the polish itself, or perhaps in sealed over micro crevices in the rock. George asked if I had been able to do any of that work, and I explained that I had not, that it was quite expensive and my funds were limited. George then asked about the second option. I told him that I'd have to invent a time machine. There was laughter. A few weeks later, I got a call from George. He told me that his station staff had all chipped in and that they had constructed a time machine. He asked if I would like to go back in time and visit the rubbing rocks. I said, "You bet." George had a radio program where actors often performed live theater. In later years, my son and I would sometimes help out. Anyway, George had written a script where he and I got in the time machine and went to visit Sunset Rocks 12,000 years in the past. The play was called An Archaeologist's Dream Day, and it's still accessible on the internet. It was a lot of fun to do. In fact, it was so much fun that we redid it as another live theater play a few years later. I visit the polished rocks every now and then. It's a 2-mile-long hike along the coastal terrace, with the rocks visible off in the distance. As you walk, the rocks gradually grow larger until they seem immense. Along the way, I think about what we would have seen 12,000 years ago, just before the last ice age ended, and just before the mammoth and bison, the saber-toothed cat, and the short-faced bear disappeared. When I think about the past, I can almost see and hear it. It's almost as if I was in a time machine.